The Soviet Union was not just a state. It was an elaborate 70-year-long exercise in architectural deceit. Every public pronouncement, every glorious statue, every brightly colored poster was a calculated distraction from the reality concealed beneath. And the biggest, darkest secret of all was the Gulag system, a sprawling archipelago of forced labor and misery that consumed millions of lives. For decades, the story we were allowed to see, the story of lumber camps, gold mines, and political re-education, was the state's managed lie. It was a story designed to be just grim enough to satisfy Western curiosity, but never complete enough to expose the true depths of the horror. But even the most meticulous totalitarian state makes mistakes, leaving tiny, almost imperceptible threads of truth dangling in the fabric of their engineered history. Our search began not in the famous camps, but in the dusty, frigid recesses of a recently declassified, low-priority security archive in a peripheral regional office. Millions of pages, millions of records, a monotonous wave of administrative death. 99% of it was standard soul-crushing bureaucracy, prisoner transfers, inventory manifests, ration requests. But then, an anomaly. A single document dated 1951 cross-referenced with a cipher that should never have appeared in this context. It wasn't a standard NKVD KGB code, but an internal, highly specialized cipher usually reserved for Ministry of Defense procurement. The document itself was a list, not of tools or rations, but of equipment, specific, high-end electronics, advanced climate control components, and vast quantities of specialized acoustic insulation. The sheer expenditure, the type of materials, and the classification level were all wildly disproportionate to any known Gulag function. It was enough to outfit a major scientific research institution, not a penal camp. It was a mathematical impossibility within the known system. The key to the cipher was hidden in a separate folder years later, disguised as an outdated meteorological report. When the layers of obfuscation were stripped away, the components on the list resolved into a single destination, a vast, uncatalogued facility in the far north of the Urals, designated only as Site 404. And, chillingly, scrawled in the margin of the original manifest, in what appeared to be an aide's hurried handwriting, was a working title, a name whispered only in the deepest halls of the security state: the Zenith. What was the Zenith? It had no record in any official Gulag directory. It had no public record as a military base. Its existence was a black hole in the Soviet map. This wasn't a standard cover-up. This was an institutional erasure. The sheer expense and the highly specialized equipment pointed not to a resource extraction camp, but to a vast, dark experiment. And if the Soviets went to such lengths to hide the location for 70 years, what unspeakable purpose? Did they go to such lengths to hide the purpose? The deciphered cipher pointed not just to a location, but to an unprecedented, uncatalogued facility codenamed the Zenith. We had the name, but the horror of its true meaning was only beginning to emerge. The journey to the area designated as Site 404 was itself a testament to the Soviet commitment to absolute concealment. The old maps were deliberately misleading, showing only vague dotted lines where roads should be. As we drove deeper into the vast, unforgiving wilderness, the landscape began to feel actively hostile, as if the very earth was protecting a secret. Finally, after days of challenging travel, we reached the nearest inhabited area, a village so small and isolated, it seemed less a community and more a temporary huddle against the indifferent cold. The locals here, descendants of the original inhabitants, bore an unnerving silence. Their eyes held a profound, inherited weariness, a knowledge too heavy to speak. When we asked about the area, they didn't deny its existence. They simply refused to acknowledge it, speaking in elliptical warnings about the fever that took the old people or the bad air that settled near the river. The consensus, communicated through hushed tones and quickly averted gazes, was clear. The town had died of shame, its memory purged by an event they could not name, but whose psychological residue still clung to the frozen earth. Local legends were our only guide. They spoke of a forbidden territory, a massive area sealed off suddenly in the early 1950s, not with barbed wire like a common camp, but with an invisible barrier of fear and absolute state authority. They spoke of the Black River that flowed through the heart of the sealed zone and how the water ran strangely clean in summer, yet unnaturally dark and silent in winter. We eventually located the outer perimeter of the zenith, not through crumbling guard towers, but through a series of oddly placed, decades-old concrete survey markers forming a massive, precisely engineered perimeter. This was not the chaotic expansion of a labor camp. This was the meticulous boundary of a colossal scientific project. The sheer scale was astronomical, dwarfing even the largest known Gulag industrial sites. Gaining access to the local ZAGs, the registry office, was a monumental bureaucratic struggle, but the persistence paid off. What the Moscow archives hid, the local bureaucracy sometimes inadvertently preserved. We found records of mass internal migration from the early 1950s, documenting the systematic and complete removal of all local population within a 20-mile radius of the site. Every family, every homestead was simply relocated and dissolved into other regions, erasing any potential eyewitnesses. More chillingly, we found detailed municipal records related to infrastructure. These showed not the simple construction of barracks and watchtowers, but the installation of immense power. Generators, dedicated rail lines carrying specialized high-capacity cooling systems, and the laying of vast subterranean communication cables. Infrastructure befitting a major metropolitan area or a high-security military command. But for whom? And for what purpose? This wasn't just a gulag. It was a self-sustaining, high-tech fortress of secrecy, built at staggering cost. The final discovery in this silent town was a faded, half-burnt land use decree from 1953, which referred to the project as a Special Scientific Research Sector, Category Alpha 7, confirming the facility's immense secret infrastructure was built for research, not for labor. The town's silence suddenly felt like a heavy, suffocating weight. The secret was too big, too dark, for even the locals to dare to remember it. Our investigation led us back to the labyrinthine depths of the Central Soviet archives in Moscow, this time armed with the specific codename The Zenith and the geographical coordinates. We demanded access to the prisoner transfer lists corresponding to that location and period. What we found defied the entire established narrative of the Gulag system. Standard Gulag lists detailed the political or criminal charge, the sentence, and the assigned labor task: logging, mining, construction. The Zenith lists, however, were meticulously categorized by professional qualification, and the qualifications were extraordinary. The documents, bound in dull, unassuming gray folders, contained no common criminals or typical political agitators. They listed names that, when cross-referenced, belonged to some of the Soviet Union's most brilliant, often repressed minds. Leading aerospace engineers, theoretical physicists, abstract expressionist artists, expert linguists, concert pianists, and specialists in advanced neurological studies. These were men and women whose skills the state had deemed both too valuable to lose, but whose ideology was too dangerous to be left free. They were not laborers, they were raw intellectual capital, precisely harvested for an unknown purpose. The sheer volume of these highly specialized individuals, thousands of them, transferred into one single remote facility, hinted at a scientific project of truly gargantuan proportions, a colossal reverse Sharashka where the prisoners were not just working on a project, but were the project. Furthermore, the transfer protocols themselves were chillingly unique. There were no listed sentences for these prisoners. They were simply designated untransferred to special status. Their previous sentences from other gulags were voided. They weren't being punished, they were being reallocated. The standard bureaucracy of misery had been replaced by a cold, calculating scientific triage. It solidified the terrifying suspicion. This was a facility built not for extraction, but for experimentation on the human mind. The search then focused on finding the directive, the highest level mandate that authorized this breathtaking expenditure and these ethically monstrous protocols. It had to exist. Such a massive project couldn't be launched without the highest Politburo approval. After weeks of cross-referencing names of high-ranking security officials mentioned in the periphery of the Zenith's logistics manifests, we found the key. A small, sealed box marked Lichny, personal, belonging to a former security chief. Inside, amongst family photos and wartime medals, was a top-secret annex document, a single page of brittle paper from the State Committee for Security, MGB, authorizing the project. The language was deliberately sterile, but utterly damning. It detailed the allocation of resources and the final horrifying objective for the facility, now named the Zenith. The chilling mandate was laid bare, written in stark, uncompromising prose. The creation of the Homo Novus via environmental and cognitive restructuring for the long-term defense and ideological purity of the Soviet state. The phrase Homo Novus, the new man, the state's ideological ultimate goal, was now revealed to be a scientific program built on the forced destruction of human individuality. The ultimate secret was out. The Soviets hid a Gulag that was built to engineer the perfect, compliant citizen. With the mandate of Homo Novus now confirmed, the architectural blueprints for the Zenith took on a sickening new clarity. These documents, previously just sterile technical drawings, became the horrific evidence of a vast, deliberate assault on the human psyche. The facility was an immense, purpose-built machine, meticulously designed to achieve its singular, terrifying goal. Forget the standard vision of a gulag. There were no plans for vast lumber processing facilities, no mining infrastructure, no sign of any traditional resource extraction. Instead, the surface plans detailed a complex of laboratories, administrative blocks, and most tellingly, dozens of large compartmentalized structures labeled environmental adaptation chambers. These chambers, detailed across dozens of pages, were the heart of the Zenith. They were not standard prison cells. They were high-tech, hermetically sealed units, equipped with advanced climate control, specialized lighting rigs capable of generating any spectrum of light, and sound systems designed for perfect acoustic isolation or, conversely, for generating precise, multi-layered auditory input. The specifications for the wall and floor insulation were astronomical, intended to cut off the inhabitant completely from any external reference point, a perfect environment for sensory deprivation and controlled psychological input. The engineers of the Zenith understood that to remake the mind, they first had to destroy its grounding in reality. The prisoners were not to be physically beaten, they were to be psychologically erased and rewritten. The contrast between this immense sterile engineering and the brutal simplicity of other gulags was stark and deeply unsettling. The initial plans showed a typical single-level prison structure, but as we cross-referenced the foundation schematics with the electrical wiring diagrams and the deep structural bore reports, a terrifying inconsistency emerged. The power requirements alone vastly exceeded the capacity for the surface structures. The structural load calculations were off by a factor of 3. The truth was hidden in plain sight, scattered across disparate documents, a vast, uncatalogued, deep underground complex. The foundation of the Zenith was merely the entrance to a true fortress built into the earth. The blueprints for this subterranean level were never officially filed. They were found in a private, heavily ciphered file belonging to the project's chief engineer, tucked away in an off-site geological survey archive. These hidden plans unveiled a network of specialized, interconnected spaces far more disturbing than the surface chambers. They included a series of heavily shielded rooms explicitly labeled sensory calibration labs, designed to allow scientists to precisely manipulate every external input, temperature, pressure, light, sound, even magnetic fields, around the prisoner. Even more chilling were the units labeled Forced Cognitive Integration Suites, small, heavily reinforced rooms designed for long-term confinement and programmed with hypnotic conditioning technology. This entire sub-level was a hidden city, a massive, dedicated laboratory for the re-engineering of consciousness. The discovery of this hidden deep underground level, unreferenced in any surface records, confirmed the Zenith was not just a secret camp, but a vast complex of sensory calibration labs designed to systematically dismantle and rebuild the human mind. The real experiment was taking place far beneath the surface. To truly understand the horror of the zenith, we had to go beyond the blueprints and the prisoner lists and locate the ideological foundation upon which this monstrous structure was built. Who believed in the necessity of destroying the minds of the Soviet Union's finest citizens to build the Homo novus? The answer was found in a series of highly inflammatory yet meticulously argued philosophical papers authored by a figure known only by his academic pseudonym, Krasny, the Red One, a hardline ideologue previously dismissed by historians as a fringe theorist. These papers, stamped with MGB approval and filed under Psychological Warfare Research, were the project's manifesto. Krasny's premise was simple and utterly chilling. The old man, the individual corrupted by bourgeois thoughts, free will, and religious superstition, was inherently incompatible with the communist future. To achieve the perfect, enduring Soviet state, the existing human mind was an obstacle that must be destroyed. He argued that brute force punishment was inefficient and left the spirit of resistance intact. The new method required surgical psychological annihilation of the self, followed by the implantation of new, perfectly compliant cognitive structures. We must, he wrote, create a clean slate, a mind that knows only the collective, a being whose internal logic is the party line. The zenith, therefore, was not a place of punishment. It was a factory for ideological purity. These documents contain detailed theories on memory erasure via sonic and light frequency manipulation and extensive research on induced fugue states to make the mind susceptible to new programming. Krasny justified the selection of the most brilliant minds by arguing they possessed the most complex and robust minds, and thus the most valuable clay to work with. If the state could break and remake the greatest dissidents, the control of the average citizen would be trivial. This was applied philosophy at its most monstrous, a state-sanctioned initiative to prove that the mind was merely a machine that could be stripped down, cleaned, and rebooted with state-approved software. The emotional detachment in these papers was almost as horrifying as the content. The prisoners were never referred to as people, subjects, or even enemies. They were consistently described using clinical, inert terminology. In the early planning documents, tucked away in a footnote detailing the psychological criteria for selection, we found the ultimate expression of the project's dehumanization. The project's most horrifying, yet fitting, internal codename for the thousands of brilliant artistic and scientific minds they had harvested and imprisoned was laid bare. It was a single, contemptuous phrase that perfectly encapsulated the scientific, ideological cruelty of the regime, reducing human beings to inert material to be molded and shaped by the state's will. The documents revealed the project's ultimate horrifying internal codename for the prisoners: the clay. They were not seen as men and women, but as raw, malleable material for the creation of the perfect totalitarian future. The clinical horror of the blueprints and ideological papers needed a human perspective, a witness to the daily atrocities. We eventually found it in the most unlikely of places, a deeply encrypted and coded journal hidden within the retirement files of a former mid-level KGB guard, Major Anatoly Razin. Razin was not a dissident, but a highly disciplined, loyal security officer whose conscience was slowly, meticulously eroded by the sheer psychological monstrosity he witnessed every day at the zenith. His journal was written in a complex, personalized code, using literary references and astronomical terms to mask the facility's activities. Razin's entries, spanning 3 years, provided a harrowing ground-level view of the operation. He detailed the unsettling professionalism of the scientific staff, who treated the prisoners with a cold, almost surgical detachment. He wrote of the oppressive silence within, the facility, broken only by the low hum of the massive ventilation and cooling systems and the occasional faint, rhythmic ticking sound emanating from the sensory calibration labs, a sound he described as the clockwork of a soul being unmade. He described the routine, not forced labor, but forced cognition. Prisoners were subjected to daily structured sessions in the chambers, followed by intense, non-physical psychological assessments. There were no beatings, Razin noted, because they were not trying to break the body. They were breaking the mind's ability to believe its own senses. He detailed specific experiments, forced hyperassociation, where innocuous symbols were paired with intense emotional stimuli until the subject broke down at the sight of a simple circle, temporal disorientation, where prisoners were kept awake for days in rooms with zero sensory input, only to be given false time markers. The goal was always the same: to divorce the individual from their own perception of reality. Razin noted that the scientists were particularly interested in linguists and poets, believing their highly advanced cognitive pathways offered the greatest challenge and, therefore, the greatest success. He described seeing these men and women enter the chambers as defiant, articulate individuals and emerge weeks later as hollow, quiet echoes, their vocabulary reduced to a handful of basic, government-approved phrases. The climax of Razin's journal, his entry marked Day 619, described a specific event that shook him to his core. He recounts a mandatory late-night security detail at the main testing block, where he witnessed the culmination of a months-long experiment on a former academic. The chief scientist, Dr. Karpov, emerged from the chamber and spoke in a flat clinical tone. Razin recorded the event with painstaking, coded detail. The scientist declared the experiment a success of phase Alpha 9. The prisoner, previously known for his fierce memory and recall, could no longer remember his own name, the faces of his family, or the basic facts of his life before the age of 10. He was, to all intents and purposes, a new, empty vessel. Razin's final terrified line in that entry captured the cold finality of the zenith success. The guard recounts a chilling event: the successful execution of protocol stasis, the complete erasure of a subject's core memories, confirming that the project had achieved the ability to wipe a person's mind clean. The general accounts from Razin's journal were harrowing, but the real power of the Zenith story lay in the specifics. Within the administrative chaos of the shutdown, detailed later, a few complete case files escaped destruction. The most detailed and devastating of these was the file of Subject P72, a famous dissident poet known throughout the cultural underground for his fierce anti-establishment verses. The state recognized his power to move people and chose him as a high-priority target for the Homo Novus project. His file was a clinical step-by-step account of the systematic destruction of his mind. The file detailed the poet's initial defiance, weeks of interrogation where he refused to recant his work, quoting his verses back to his interrogators. The scientific team, led by Dr. Karpov, then initiated a long-term protocol that lasted over 9 months. Phase 1. Sensory disassembly. For 2 months, the poet was kept in a calibration lab with total darkness and silence, broken only by a non-rhythmic random burst of white noise. The goal was to destroy his internal rhythm and his poet's sense of meter, time, and sound. Phase 2. Cognitive restructuring. Here, the poet was subjected to hypnotic conditioning loops delivered through embedded acoustic transmitters in his pillow. These loops contained complex party-line propaganda slogans repeated thousands of times, interspersed with his own altered verses. His beautiful, defiant poetry was surgically twisted into dull, subservient chants. The file meticulously tracked his neurological responses to chemical interference, small, non-lethal doses of compounds designed to temporarily destabilize his short-term memory and make him more suggestible to the hypnotic loops. The reports noted the poet's attempts at resistance. He would try to write new verses in his mind, only to find the implanted slogans overwhelming his own thoughts. His most desperate act, recorded by the scientists as a successful stress point, was his attempt to physically tear out his own tongue, believing the organ was betraying him. The scientists intervened, not to save him, but to preserve the experiment. The file concluded with a final, chilling assessment. After the 9 months, the poet was deemed compliant. He could still write, but his words were now bland, repetitive, and entirely focused on agricultural output and the glory of the party. His beautiful, complex language was gone, replaced by simple, servile prose. The The clinical language of the final report masked the true horror. They had not only silenced a dissident, they had taken the most creative part of his mind and turned it into an obedient tool. The final administrative entry was brief, cold, and final, raising the terrifying question of his current whereabouts. The final entry on the poet's file. Subject deemed successful. Reintegrated. New designation. Unit 1. The poet was gone, replaced by a perfectly compliant state-engineered operative now deployed for an unknown, sinister purpose. The Zenith's eventual end was not the glorious exposure that the handful of internal dissidents hoped for, but a sudden, chaotic collapse engineered by the very state that created it. Despite the high security and the ruthless efficiency of the KGB oversight, the moral stench of the project began to sicken some of the lower-tier technical staff. Dr. Karpov and the core scientific team remained fanatically dedicated, but among the junior technicians, the administrative clerks, and the mid-level guards like Anatoly Razin, a slow, festering moral revolt began to take hold. The acts of sabotage were subtle at first, designed not to destroy the facility, but to compromise its data and delay its success. Technicians began deliberately miscalibrating the sensory calibration labs, causing the implanted memory loops to become garbled and ineffective. Clerks falsified energy consumption reports, confusing the central administrative supply chain. This internal chaos caused months of confusion for the lead scientists, who struggled to replicate their successful results. The project, which was supposed to yield immediate game-changing results, began to flounder under the weight of its own internal ethical rot. The climax came when a small group, including a brave junior neurologist, risked everything to create a minor explosion in the main data processing center, destroying years of meticulous, horrifying data. The Soviet state did not tolerate failure or exposure. The response was swift, brutal, and absolute. Based on hastily scribbled notes in a high-level report, the MGB determined that the project had become too unstable, too compromised by internal dissent, and too expensive to continue with its current personnel. In the spring of 1956, without warning, the entire facility was plunged into a state of emergency. Security forces, arriving by rail and air, executed a brutal and rapid purge. All remaining staff deemed non-essential, including all technicians, clerks, and most guards, were quickly rounded up and transferred to conventional remote labor camps, the ultimate punishment for having seen too much. Key scientific personnel, including Dr. Karpov, were transferred under maximum security to an unknown location. Most terrifyingly, the final groups of successful units and a massive amount of highly sensitive data were rushed out of the complex in a desperate, final extraction effort. The last remaining records of the Zenith detailed a massive convoy moving south and east, with a specific, high-level directive referencing a secret location in the Soviet sphere. The facility itself was systematically demolished and sealed with concrete, disguised forever as the failed agricultural project it was initially designed to mimic. The final records show a mass transfer of all remaining units and data to an unspecified location in Central Asia, leaving the crucial, horrifying question unresolved. Where did these perfected, mind-controlled operatives finally go, and for what purpose were they deployed? Following the catastrophic collapse and subsequent purge of the Zenith, the survivors, those who had seen too much but were not considered part of the core project, were scattered across the vastness of the Gulag system, their testimony effectively neutralized by the state and by their own trauma. The clerks, the lower-tier guards, and the failed clay who were deemed too psychologically fragile for transfer were simply dissolved into the general population of labor camps. Their fragmented stories of mind control, clean rooms, and silent psychological terror were inevitably dismissed as the delirium of the mentally broken. This part of the investigation relied on sifting through decades of psychiatric reports and internal medical notes from remote Gulag infirmaries. The patterns were undeniable. Individuals transferred from the Urals during the mid-1950s often exhibited unique, non-standard symptoms of trauma. They suffered from profound linguistic disassociation, where they could no longer confidently name common objects or could only speak in the third person as if their own identity was external to them. One former prisoner, a mathematician, spent the rest of his life drawing complex, beautiful equations, but was unable to perform simple arithmetic, a chilling suggestion that the most advanced parts of his mind were left intact while the core self was destroyed. The medical records often concluded with a diagnosis of political paranoia or advanced psychosis, effectively burying the truth under the guise of mental illness. The final piece of irrefutable external confirmation, however, came from the unlikely source of a deathbed confession. We tracked down the family of a former KGB medical officer, Dr. Leonid Orlov, who had been peripherally involved in the initial physical assessments of the prisoners transferred into the Zenith. Before his death in the late 1990s, Orlov, burdened by guilt, left behind a meticulously documented, encrypted ledger. In it, he confirmed the existence of Project Zenith and its horrifying purpose, the creation of a psychologically compliant, non-violent political operator. He detailed the selection criteria and the extreme lengths taken to erase any physical evidence of their passing. Most importantly, Orlov provided a final harrowing piece of evidence that tied the scientific operation to its political outcome. He noted that the most successful units were not sent for military service, but were subtly inserted into mid-level positions in key ideological institutions, media, education, and cultural oversight. Their mission was not to lead, but to ensure conformity, to subtly guide public thought along pre-approved channels. The confession confirmed that the horrifying experimentation was successful and that the reprogrammed individuals were deployed. The survivors' burden wasn't just physical, it was the psychological terror of knowing that the people they once were now walk among the free, a perfected tool of the totalitarian state. The discovery of a deathbed confession from a retired KGB doctor not only confirms the existence of the Zenith, but provides a final, damning piece of evidence. The deployed units were inserted into civilian life as agents of silent psychological conformity. The final act of Project Zenith's long-hidden story is the synthesis of all the disparate evidence, the ciphered manifest, the silenced town, the specialized prisoner lists, the horrifying blueprints, the ideologist's manifesto, the guard's journal, and the survivor's scars. The truth that the Soviets hid for 70 years was not just another mass grave or forced labor site. It was a state-sanctioned, massive-scale scientific initiative to weaponize the human mind itself. The true goal of the Zenith was the creation of the Homo Novus, the new man, a being stripped of free will, independent thought, and personal memory, perfected for the maintenance of an eternal monolithic totalitarian state. The sheer scale of the project, the massive expenditure, and the ruthless efficiency in hiding it reveals the Soviet leadership's ultimate aspiration: to secure the revolution not through economic might or military power, but through complete psychological dominance over its own people. They weren't just seeking to control the body, they were seeking to own the consciousness. The existence of the Zenith fundamentally alters our understanding of the Soviet political machine, showing that it moved beyond mere oppression into the realm of radical, applied social engineering on its most brilliant citizens. The chilling final realization is not that the Zenith existed, but that its techniques were successful, and, as confirmed by Dr. Orlov's confession, were subsequently deployed and adapted for mass application. The units were sent out not to conduct espionage, but to perform silent, deep-rooted ideological and cultural conformity. The project's legacy wasn't just the few hundred fully re-engineered individuals. It was the methods they perfected for controlling language, manipulating environmental input, and creating subtle, pervasive psychological pressure. These methods, refined and scaled down, were silently introduced into the educational system, the state media, and the cultural apparatus of the Soviet sphere. The story of the Zenith is a stark, cold warning. It is a testament to the fact that the most profound abuses of power are often committed not with blunt force, but with the ruthless clinical efficiency of science detached from morality. The truth lay hidden because its implications were too terrifying for the world to grasp, that the Soviet state was attempting to engineer the end of individualism itself. The final, horrifying truth is that the goal was achieved not in a single dramatic act, but through a slow, systematic application of the techniques developed at the zenith, creating a silent legacy of engineered conformity that shaped generations of Soviet life. The secrets of the zenith are finally out, and they serve as a chilling reminder of what happens when the human mind becomes the ultimate enemy of the state.